Hi guys, this is Dr. Gonzalez, and I wanted to make a video to walk you through the second assignment for non-experimental methods and statistics. As you know, from watching the other videos and from looking at the syllabus, one of the most important things in this course will be your final paper. And that counts for a considerable amount of your final grade. So, given that July seems a long way off, I want you to start thinking now about how that paper is put together. Last week, you came up with a very short literature review. Hopefully, by this point in time, you understand some of the things that are out there when it comes to your chosen research topic, or research question rather. In this video, I'm going to walk you through week 2's assignment, which is basically writing a considerable part of your procedure or your methodology in your paper. So you're going to write this assignment and submit it to me, and I'm going to get feedback to you. I want you to be aware that it is really important that you review that feedback and incorporate it into your final paper at the end of the course. So your assignment this week has several components to it, but they're all going to be in one template, okay? This assignment is going to cover your research question, the definitions of the variables that we've covered so far, your preliminary hypotheses, how you're going to address validity, and your population of interest and how you intend to sample from them. And all of these topics are topics that we either covered last week in the first week of class or we covered this week. So if you have not watched the lecture videos from this week, I really recommend that you go back and do that before you start this assignment. The first part of the template is simply for you to state your research question. Hopefully at this point in time, you've got one that you've picked that interests you, and you have reached out to me if you want to change it from the list of approved questions that I posted in Canvas. The only reason why I'm asking you to restate your research question here is because it's really a reference point for me when I'm grading. I can look at the top of your paper, see your question, and then I can see how each of the components are relating back to your research question. So for the purposes of this video, I have selected a random research question, and I'm going to use that as a reference. Of course, you're going to use your research question when you do this assignment. So on the screen right now, you should see a slide that talks about your research question. And in these examples, I'm going to use the question here that says, is there an association between sleep quality and sleep chronotype in adults? Sleep quality, you probably understand. That's how well you sleep at night. And that's just a very easy thing to kind of conceptualize. And we'll get into that when we talk about variables. But you may not have heard the words sleep chronotype. Sleep chronotype is a scientific term for a person's natural preference for the timing of their sleep cycle and their wakefulness across a 24-hour day. So in other words, it's a scientific term for the descriptives that we commonly hear, like I'm a morning person or I'm a night owl. After you restate your research question, you're going to go into part 1. And this is where we talk about the variables of interest in your study. And I have put my research question up here at the top of the screen for you, just so you can see that as we talk. In the variables section, we're going to address your constructs, your operational definitions, and then your IV and your DV, which are also going to be very similar to that operational definition. So if we start with constructs, this study that I proposed here has 2 constructs. Your study should also have 2 constructs, because constructs are the theoretical terms that we use for the overarching variables of your project. So I'm interested in how sleep quality and sleep chronotype might be associated with one another. These are subjective ideas, right? Sleep quality, I need to define that better, and I will in just a moment. But for the purposes of constructs, sleep quality is totally appropriate. So when you write construct 1, it might be 1 or 2 words. Same thing with construct 2. In the lecture video, I discussed what constructs are. Remember, they are broad, overarching theoretical ideas that could possibly be interpreted differently by different people. So for the example of sleep quality, when you think of sleep quality, you might be thinking of just how long somebody sleeps, right? If a person sleeps 8 hours, you might think, well, they've got great sleep quality. Well, another person might understand sleep quality as being how rested they felt when they wake up. So those are two different things, and that's okay for a construct. We're going to define it differently and in depth in a moment. After the constructs, you're going to come up with your operational definitions. Remember, operational definitions start scratching the surface of how you are going to define those constructs in your research. So I have defined the operational definition of sleep quality as an overall quality and pattern of a person's sleep. And I'm going to measure it using a validated tool that includes data on sleep duration, nighttime awakening, sleep latency, sleep disturbance, and impact of sleep on daytime functioning. Now, I left it as a validated tool right now because I already know what tool I'm going to use. You may not know that at this point in time because one of your assignments in week 3 will be to look at the measurement tools that might exist out there in order to measure whatever you're trying to measure in your study. I could have said here sleep quality will be measured using the PSYC. That's what I'm going to use, but instead, so that I give a better operational definition, I am going to use all of these words right here because those are components of that measure that I'm going to talk about later on. I might also add here that I would use data from an Apple Watch. That would give another component of sleep quality. So you can go into as much depth as you want here. For the purposes of this example, I basically just kept it short so you could get a general idea. Sleep chronotype, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to define it as a preference for earlier or later timing for sleep, waking, and daily activities. And I'm also going to measure it using a validated tool. And again, I know what that tool is simply because I have taught this course multiple times and I know what I would use here. And it's the morningness, eveningness questionnaire in case you are curious about that. It's a validated tool. A person takes it and they're classified as either a morning-oriented, intermediate, or evening-oriented person depending on how they score. So those are my operational definitions. Now, you'll notice in just a moment that the independent and dependent variables are just variations of these definitions, and that's okay. So your independent variable in a non-experimental research setting is your predictor. So I'm trying to predict if there's an association in sleep quality based on a person's chronotype. So chronotype is my predictor variable, and I'm not manipulating that variable. I'm looking at the way it exists naturally. So that's why I'm going to give my participants their questionnaire about sleep, preferences for time of day. And I'm going to let them put themselves in their category depending on their results. I'm not manipulating anything. I'm simply observing how it exists in the real world. And what I'm trying to do here is predict the quality of someone's sleep based on their self-identified chronotype. So my dependent variable or my response variable is sleep quality. So again, I'm looking for an association in sleep quality based on sleep chronotype. What I would like to do in this study is to be able to associate higher quality sleep with one particular chronotype. That way I could go on and predict someone's sleep based on their chronotype. Now, to do this, I'm going to examine the relationship using data that I collect later on. Sleep quality is a measured response variable, and it responds to a person's chronotype, so that's why I have defined it as my dependent variable. Now, Part 2, you're going to get into the hypotheses for this as part of the hypothesis testing. If you watch the hypothesis testing video, you'll notice that a lot of the hypotheses in there were related to a specific statistic. I was looking to see if there was a difference in a mean or there was a Pearson's R that was significant. For the purposes of this part of the paper right now, we're going to write it using words and not statistics. So how does research take place? Normally, it's an iterative process, and that means that we go through a series of steps, and then we evaluate our outcome and start again. So we conduct studies, we analyze the data, we publish our results, other researchers look at our results, and then they come up with new ideas, and the process starts all over again. I recognize this is just one single non-experimental methods class that you're taking. You don't have time to go through the entire process. as evidenced by the literature review. I only expect you to have between 5 and 10 sources. A good literature review takes a couple of months to write. We don't have a couple of months. So we're going to do the best with what we have. In other words, you're going to go with your gut when you're writing these hypotheses. The most important thing is to understand the bottom line basic difference between a null and an alternative and to simply be able to write them using words correctly. So your null hypothesis is the statement that says there's no difference between these groups. Okay, I found no association between the predictor variable and the response variable, or the IV and the DV. We're focusing on association claims with these research questions. They should all be able to be evaluated using a Pearson's correlation. Okay, so when you're wording your hypothesis, you can use the word correlation, association, or relationship. Anything else is probably getting outside of the realms of what you could do with a correlation. And we want to keep this non-experimental, focused on association claims. So my null hypothesis in this situation says there's no association, correlation, or relationship. You can pick one of those words. I listed these 3 just so you could see the wording using each one, but pick one and stick with that. Okay, so I'm going to just go with the first one here. In your template, you would write, there is no association between sleep quality and sleep chronotype in adults. Notice, this hypothesis just says there's no association. It doesn't say that there's no positive or there's no negative, because when I write my statistic part of this paper, I'm going to redefine that null hypothesis and my alternative hypothesis if I'm going to do a one-tailed or a two-tailed test. Okay? And that I went into depth in the hypothesis testing video. You can go back and watch that. So what we can do when we do the research is we can either reject the null, which says the null is not supported, or I can fail to reject the null. Fail to reject means my alternative hypothesis was supported, not my null. So let's continue by looking at the alternative. Remember, if the null says there's no association, the alternative hypothesis is going to postulate that there is an association. Again, this is a two-tailed hypothesis here, because I'm not saying if it's better or worse sleep depending on your predictor variable. I'm just saying that there's a difference. There's an association. Remember, you can use the word correlation, association, or relationship, but use the same word that you used with your null. So my alternative hypothesis here says there is an association between sleep quality and sleep chronotype in adults. So if we find that our results are statistically significant, I'm going to reject the null, and I'm going to say that the results I found support my alternative. So for the purposes of this assignment, you're going to write your null and your alternative hypothesis. It should just be one statement. That's it. Or 2 statements, one for the null, one for the alternative. In part 3, you're going to address validity. And I recognize that this is probably one of the portions of this assignment that you might not have seen a lot about in the past. So you might want to go back and watch the video again on validity in experimental research. So there were 4 kinds of validity that we talked about. We talked about construct, statistical, external, and internal validity. You're not going to address internal validity because that is generally associated with causal claims. And we're not making a causal claim. We're making an association claim. So we're going to cover these 3: construct, statistical, and external. So how do you address construct validity? Remember, in construct validity, we are worried about those conceptual definitions that we came up with earlier in our variables section. We want to make sure we are measuring the right thing. So what you are talking about is that your measure covers all of the relevant aspects of your theoretical construct. So if you go back to the lecture notes, you'll find specific information about construct validity threats and how to address them. So in your assignment, I simply want you to write a paragraph under the proper heading for construct validity. I want you to define what construct validity is, recognize the threats that were in the presentation, and then tell me some of the ways that you're going to address them. That's all you have to do. This is one of the places where I would say, with much caution, referring to AI to help you get ideas would be an appropriate thing. I'm not saying it's okay to go in there and say, hey, ChatGPT, tell me how to address validity in this research question, and then copying and pasting that information. But Using AI as a sounding board to get ideas on how to address it would be an appropriate use. So I could also say the same thing about going and Googling this. So you have that ability. Be careful with it. Use AI as a tool and not as a generator. You're going to do the same thing for statistical validity. Remember that statistical validity is concerned with our data that we've collected and how well they support our claim. So you're asking yourself the question of, are my statistical conclusions accurate, reliable, and appropriate based on the methods and the data that I used and collected? So again, refer back to your notes, look at statistical validity in your response, define it, and address the threats. Remember, the statistic that you're going to use is a Pearson's correlation. And I know we haven't gone into what that is just yet. You should have seen that earlier in your basic statistics course. But I'm helping you out here by pushing you to use Pearson's correlation so that you don't have to go out and learn a whole bunch of information about another statistic. And I've done that by boxing you into a specific kind of research design that is a correlation or an association study. Finally, for validity, you're going to address external validity. Remember, that is related to how well your results apply to other situations. Those can be other groups of people, other settings, other times, and other situations. So again, go back to your notes, review external validity, and your response, define what it is. Look at the threats that are in the notes and tell me how you can address those threats to make your results more valid and apply to more populations. The fourth part has to do with your population and sampling. So you'll notice that up here in my research question, I say, is there an association between sleep quality and sleep chronotype? And I have in adults. So for my population, I need to define what an adult's going to be. And that isn't just what is the age for an adult. I probably need to look at living in Houston, because University of Houston, right? So your population statement, you're going to say, my population of interest is adults. I'm defining that as any person who is over the age of 18 years old. I'm also going to limit my results to the Houston area. Now, you might want to also think about exclusion criteria. This is a study about sleep quality and sleep chronotype. I probably want to exclude a couple of groups of people. For example, one that I listed on the slide here is people who have a diagnosis of a sleep disorder. Someone who has sleep apnea or narcolepsy probably does not need to be included in this study. Additionally, I probably don't want to include people who are shift workers or work the night shift, right? So nurses that are working overnights in hospitals, paramedics, police officers. Those are just two exclusion criteria. There may be more. And there may not be a reason to exclude people as well, but in this particular research question, there is. So if that is the situation with your question, you need to address that under the population portion. Now for sampling, there was a video about sampling, and there's a set of notes, and there are two basic groups of sampling methods. There are the probability or random sampling techniques, and then there are biased sampling techniques. In your final paper, you're only going to use one technique, okay? You can go back to your textbook and look at the different techniques. The notes and the presentation also talk about those techniques. This would also be an appropriate place to use Google to help you get ideas, or dare I say, ChatGPT or a similar AI. Now, for this assignment, you are proposing two methods, one probability and then one biased. Describe those sampling techniques for me, and then I'm going to give you feedback, and you're going to include that feedback in your final paper when you write that later in the course. So when you're done, you're going to upload that assignment to Canvas. I'm going to grade it and give you feedback. Please review that feedback. It's important. I spend a lot of time giving you that feedback, and I've noticed in the past a lot of students just look at the grade and go on, but they don't look at the detailed feedback. You want to do that so that you can include it in your final paper. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'll be happy to work with you to answer them. I will be traveling this week, so my ability to answer emails might be just a little delayed towards the beginning of the week, but I promise I will be as quick as I can about getting back to you. If you need office hours, also please reach out. Have a great day, and please Start working now so that you don't have a bunch of work when it comes time for your paper in in July. Take care.